The chain fence rattled across my shoreline as two workers locked it into fresh steel posts. A white HOA sign slapped against the wire, claiming my lake ranch was now Clearwater Shores community property. Behind that fence sat my dock, my hay barn, my boat ramp, and 3 miles of pasture the HOA had already marked for a luxury expansion. A guard waved traffic toward the clubhouse road, where residents, delivery trucks, and utility crews were being rerouted through land my family still controlled on the original 1958 ranch survey. That was their first serious mistake. The wind pushed the smell of wet grass and diesel across the lake. My truck idled 10 feet from the new barrier. Gravel popped under the tires as I eased forward and stopped. The workers would not look at me. One of them kept tightening a chain with a silver ratchet like he had been told not to answer questions. The morning sun hit the water behind them, bright and sharp, but the whole place felt cold. Then a security guard stepped out from beside a temporary booth. He wore a navy jacket with the Clearwater Shores logo stitched on the chest. "Sir, you need to turn around," he said. "This area is restricted pending HOA review." I looked past him at the shoreline. My cattle gate was gone. My ranch sign was gone. In its place stood 3 orange survey stakes and a laminated notice zip-tied to the fence. Proposed Lakeside Recreation Zone. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. I could hear the leather creak under my fingers. "That is my land," I said. The guard glanced down at his clipboard. His eyes moved across the page before he looked back up. "The board has determined this section falls within community boundaries." Board. Boundaries. Soft words for taking something that was not theirs. A golf cart hummed up from the clubhouse side of the fence. Patricia Monroe sat behind the wheel in a pale blue blazer, dark sunglasses, and a smile clean enough to cut glass. 2 HOA board members rode behind her with folders pressed against their knees. A younger man in a reflective vest walked beside them, carrying a rolled map under one arm. Patricia stopped at the gate and did not get out. That told me plenty. "Jack Dawson," she said, loud enough for the workers to hear. "You were notified this access was under review. My name is Jack Dawson. I am 41 years old, and that ranch was my grandfather's before it was my father's before it became mine. I was not a developer. I was not a resort investor. I fixed fences, cleared brush, repaired docks, and paid taxes on land my family had protected for more than 60 years. Patricia looked at my muddy boots and then at my old pickup. Her smile barely moved. "This community has grown beyond outdated private arrangements," she said. "We are correcting the map." The word correcting landed hard. Near the shoreline, I noticed something taped to the corner post. A new plat drawing. Fresh ink. Clean borders. The ranch was shaded inside the HOA limits like it had always belonged to them. But the old drainage ditch was missing. So was the cattle lane. So was the stone marker near the western oak. My grandfather never trusted new maps without old ones beside them. Patricia tapped the folder in her lap. "You have 30 days to remove personal property from the designated community zone." A heron lifted from the reeds behind her and disappeared over the water. Nobody spoke until its wings faded into the wind. Then my phone buzzed. It was a message from my ranch manager. 3 supply trucks had been stopped at the south entrance. 2 guests had canceled. A utility crew was asking who owned the service road. Patricia had not just put a fence across my shoreline. She had started a chain reaction. I stepped out of the truck and the wet gravel sank under my boots. The lake kept moving behind the fence. Quiet. Patient. Older than every sign she had planted that morning. I looked at Patricia, then at the map, then at the road running beneath all of them. This was no longer about a fence. I stayed at the shoreline for another 20 minutes after Patricia drove away. The workers kept tightening bolts and stretching chain across sections of land they had no business touching. Metal clanked against metal. The sound carried across the water. Every few minutes, another HOA vehicle rolled through the gate. They acted like the operation had been planned for weeks. That detail stayed with me. I finally climbed back into my truck and drove toward the northern ridge overlooking the ranch. The road curved through oak trees and tall grass before opening onto a bluff above the lake. From there I could see almost everything. The main barn, the cattle pasture, the western boat launch, the fishing docks, the shoreline cabins. Generations of work spread across hundreds of acres. Morning sunlight shimmered across the water. White birds drifted above the reeds. At first glance, the ranch looked unchanged. Then the new markers started appearing. Bright orange survey flags dotted the shoreline. White stakes stood near the pasture fence. Several areas had fresh paint markings on the ground. Somebody had been busy. I pulled out binoculars from the truck and scanned the property. Near the old marina, two contractors were measuring sections of the dock. Near the south field, another crew was placing boundary markers. My jaw tightened. They were treating the ranch like a future project site, not private property. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Hank, my ranch manager. Wind rushed through the speaker as he talked. The feed supplier turned around. I looked down toward the access road. Why? I asked. Hank let out a long breath. HOA security told them they needed authorization. The lake suddenly felt very quiet. Feed deliveries, utility crews, maintenance contractors, guests, vendors. Everything moved through the ranch every week. If Patricia disrupted those systems long enough, the damage would spread far beyond me. That was the real threat. Around noon, I stopped by the marina store near the eastern shore. The bell above the door jingled when I stepped inside. Coffee brewed somewhere behind the counter. The smell mixed with lake water and old wood. Two fishermen near the bait refrigerator stopped talking when they saw me. One gave a quick nod. The other looked away. News traveled fast around the lake. Too fast. The owner handed me a receipt and lowered his voice. People are talking about a big expansion. He glanced toward the window. They think the HOA already owns everything. That sentence followed me all afternoon. By sunset, I returned to the ranch house overlooking the western pasture. The sky glowed orange across the water. Shadows stretched over the fields. For years, evenings here had felt predictable. That evening did not. I spread several recent notices across the kitchen table. Survey requests, compliance letters, boundary reviews. Every document carried the same assumption. The ranch belonged inside their plan. Then I noticed something printed in small text at the bottom of one notice. A map revision reference number. I had never seen that number before. I picked up the paper and looked closer. Something about it did not fit. The next morning, I decided to find out why. The county records office opened at 8 o'clock sharp. I was waiting in the parking lot before the first employee unlocked the front door. The morning air smelled like wet pavement and fresh-cut grass. A delivery truck backed into an alley across the street. Its warning beeps echoed between the buildings. I carried the notice from my kitchen table under one arm. The map revision number was highlighted in yellow. That detail had bothered me all night. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The lobby was nearly empty. A woman behind the records counter greeted me and asked what I needed. I handed her the notice and pointed at the reference number. She typed for several seconds. Then she stopped. Her eyes narrowed slightly. That was the first thing I noticed. She typed again, this time more slowly. Finally, she looked up. That revision was filed recently. I nodded. How recently? She checked the screen again. About 4 months ago. For months. That timeline matched too many other things. The survey stakes. The HOA notices. The expansion plans. Somebody had been preparing this long before the fence appeared. The clerk printed several documents and slid them across the counter. I thanked her and carried them to a table near the window. Sunlight reflected off parked cars outside. I spread the papers across the surface and started reading. Most of the language was technical. Boundary updates. Parcel adjustments. Reference corrections. Nothing dramatic. Then, I reached the attached map. I froze. The ranch boundary looked different. Not completely different. Just enough. A corner near the lake had shifted. A drainage corridor had vanished. Several acreage calculations no longer matched the figures I knew by heart. Someone unfamiliar with the property would never notice. I did. The strange part came next. The revision referenced another map. An older map. I requested a copy immediately. 20 minutes later, the clerk returned carrying a large rolled document. The paper was faded and fragile. She handled it carefully. This one hasn't been requested in years, she said. That detail stayed with me. I unrolled the map across the table. My eyes moved from one landmark to another. The western oak marker. The cattle lane. The drainage ditch. Everything was there. Everything the newer version omitted. My pulse slowed. Not because I had answers. Because I finally had a direction. Outside, a church bell rang somewhere downtown. The sound drifted through the glass. I compared both maps side by side. The differences were small, precise, intentional. Someone had not redrawn the entire property. They had altered specific pieces. Pieces connected directly to the shoreline and future development area. Around noon my phone rang. It was Hank again. This time his voice sounded tighter. "You need to see this." I stepped outside and asked what happened. "They started marketing materials today." Wind crackled through the call. Billboards, brochures, everything. My stomach tightened. Patricia was not acting like someone waiting for approval. She was acting like someone already celebrating victory. I looked down at the two maps in my hands. One old, one new. Between them sat a story nobody was talking about yet. And I had a feeling it started much earlier than anyone realized. The billboards appeared 3 days later. I saw the first one while driving into town for supplies. A massive rendering stood beside the highway entrance. Bright blue water, luxury homes, private marina access, walking trails. The development stretched across land I recognized immediately. My shoreline, my pasture, my boat launch. The image looked polished enough for a magazine cover. At the bottom sat the Clearwater Shores logo. Cars slowed to look at it. A few people even pulled over to take pictures. That detail bothered me. Patricia was no longer talking about future possibilities. She was selling certainty. I parked beside the feed store and walked inside. The smell of grain and fertilizer filled the air. A radio played softly behind the counter. Two ranchers were discussing the development before they noticed me standing nearby. The conversation stopped instantly. News was spreading faster than facts. By the end of the week, more signs appeared around the lake. Brochures showed up in mailboxes. Promotional banners hung outside the HOA clubhouse. Every image included pieces of my property. Every slogan assumed ownership had already changed. The pressure kept building. Hank called nearly every day. A contractor canceled a maintenance agreement. A fishing group moved their annual event to another lake. Even a local equipment supplier hesitated before extending a routine delivery contract. Patricia did not need a court ruling. She only needed enough people to believe her version of the story. That was the dangerous part. One afternoon, I stopped near the clubhouse entrance to take a closer look at one of the display boards. Workers were installing decorative stone around a new information center. Residents walked past carrying coffee cups and pamphlets. Most looked excited. Some looked curious. Nobody looked concerned. Then I noticed a large master plan mounted under glass. Colored lines stretched across the entire development. Roads, utility corridors, recreation zones, expansion phases. I stepped closer. My eyes followed the shoreline, then the pasture, then the marina. Everything connected back to the same revised map I found at the county office. The same missing landmarks, the same altered boundaries. That was no coincidence. A voice interrupted my thoughts. "Beautiful project, isn't it?" I turned and found Patricia standing beside me. She wore sunglasses despite the cloudy sky. Her expression looked relaxed, almost cheerful. She folded her arms and studied the board like she was admiring a finished painting. "People are excited," she said. "The community deserves room to grow." I looked back at the map. Growth and ownership are not the same thing. Her smile barely changed. "Maps tell stories, Jack." Then she walked away before I could answer. Those words stayed with me. That evening I spread both county maps across my dining table again. The old one, the revised one. The differences seemed larger every time I studied them. Not because the lines changed, because the consequences became clearer. Outside, wind pushed waves against the shoreline. Inside, the kitchen light reflected across faded survey paper. Then I noticed a reference notation hidden along the bottom edge of the older map. It pointed to another document entirely, one I had never seen before. The reference notation kept pulling my attention back to the corner of the map. It was small, easy to miss, just a series of numbers followed by an abbreviated filing code. Most people would have ignored it. I did not. The next morning I drove straight to the old ranch house my grandfather built near the western pasture. Fog drifted above the grass. Dew covered the fence rails. The smell of wet cedar hung in the air. Inside, the house was quiet except for the ticking of an old wall clock. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains and stretched across the hardwood floor. I carried the map into the study and laid it on the desk. The notation matched something I had seen before. I just could not remember where. That detail bothered me. I spent the next 2 hours opening drawers, sorting folders, and checking filing cabinets. Most of what I found was ordinary. Tax records, equipment receipts, maintenance logs. Then I opened a cabinet beneath the bookshelf and found a small iron safe bolted to the wall. The safe had not been opened in years. Dust coated the handle. My grandfather rarely locked things away unless they mattered. The combination still worked. The metal door clicked open. Inside sat several document tubes, a leather ledger, and a stack of yellow folders tied together with faded twine. The smell of old paper drifted out immediately. I carried everything to the desk. The first folder contained surveys from the late 1950s. The second held property descriptions. The third contained correspondence between surveyors and county officials. Piece by piece, a pattern started forming. The same landmarks appeared repeatedly. The same boundaries. The same measurements. Then I found a folded note tucked between two survey sheets. The handwriting belonged to my grandfather. I recognized it instantly. The message was short. Only 4 words. Never trust their map. I read it twice. Then a third time. The room suddenly felt smaller. Outside, wind pushed against the porch screen. The old clock kept ticking. I went back through the files with fresh eyes. Several survey references connected directly to the notation I found on the revised map. One led to a master survey completed before the HOA ever existed. Another pointed toward county filings that predated most of the homes around the lake. My pulse slowed. Not from relief. From focus. Somebody had spent decades preserving these records. That should have told me something. Around noon, Hank called again. A tour bus had arrived at the clubhouse carrying potential buyers. Promotional signs were going up across the development. Patricia was moving faster than ever. Every hour she gained more momentum. Every hour, more people assumed her version of the story was true. I looked across the desk at the growing stack of documents. The old surveys. The notes. The filing references. They all pointed somewhere. The question was where. Then I opened the leather ledger. Tucked inside the front cover was a county recording number I had never seen before. The county recording number sat at the top of the ledger page in my grandfather's handwriting. Beneath it was a date from decades ago and a short note underlined twice. Original master filing. I copied the number onto a notepad and drove back to the county archives the next morning. Low clouds hung over the lake. The roads were wet from overnight rain. Water dripped from pine branches as I pulled into the parking lot. Inside, the archive room felt colder than I remembered. Rows of shelves stretched across the building. Old boxes filled every aisle. The clerk took the recording number and disappeared into a back room. Several minutes passed. I could hear carts rolling somewhere behind the walls. Then she returned carrying a thick storage box covered in dust. She set it on the table and glanced at the label. "This one has not been checked out in a very long time," she said. That detail stayed with me. I opened the box carefully. Inside were maps, surveys, correspondence, and county filings dating back more than half a century. The smell of old paper rose immediately. I started working through the records one by one. Most were routine. Boundary descriptions, easement references, utility agreements. Then I found the master survey. The document unfolded across nearly the entire table. My eyes moved from landmark to landmark. The western ridge, the shoreline, the old cattle lane, the marina. Every feature matched the records from my grandfather's safe. Every feature missing from the revised map appeared here. Outside the archive window, rain started falling again. The soft tapping against the glass seemed louder with every page I turned. Then I reached a supplemental filing attached to the survey. The paper was older than everything else in the box. Several signatures lined the bottom. Surveyors, county officials, previous landowners. I followed the legal description across multiple pages. The language was dense, but one section appeared repeatedly. A large parcel surrounding the lake. A parcel that extended far beyond my ranch. I read it again, then a third time. My pulse slowed. Not because I was confused, because I was beginning to understand. Around noon my phone buzzed. It was Hank. Another promotional event was happening at the clubhouse. Potential buyers were touring model homes. Contractors were staking new locations for future amenities. Patricia was moving ahead as if every question had already been answered. The pressure kept growing. I ended the call and returned to the documents. The next file contained a series of historical property transfers. Ownership changed hands several times over the years. New homes were built. Roads were added. Utility corridors expanded. Yet one thing remained consistent. The original parcel description kept appearing beneath every transaction. The same foundation, the same survey, the same source document. I leaned back in my chair and looked across the table. Suddenly, the entire conflict felt different. Patricia thought this was a dispute over a ranch. The records were pointing somewhere much larger, much older. The final map in the box confirmed it. A bold boundary line wrapped around nearly the entire modern HOA development. And the name attached to that original parcel stopped me cold. The name attached to the original parcel was Dawson Ranch Holdings. My family's name sat there in black ink beneath a survey recorded decades before Clearwater Shores existed. I stared at the document for several seconds. Rain continued tapping against the archive window. Cars passed outside on the wet street. Inside, the room felt perfectly still. I reviewed the page again, then another page, then the supplemental filings. The same name appeared over and over. The same parcel description. The same survey foundation supporting every later development around the lake. That detail mattered. It mattered more than anything Patricia had shown on her polished maps. I made certified copies before leaving the archives. The clerk watched quietly as the machine hummed beside us. She did not ask questions. That was probably for the best. By the time I stepped outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight pushed through the clouds and reflected off puddles across the parking lot. My phone buzzed before I reached the truck. Hank again. You should see the clubhouse, he said. They are acting like the expansion is already approved. I drove straight toward the lake. Traffic was heavier than usual. New banners lined the entrance roads. Promotional flags snapped in the wind. A temporary sales tent stood beside the clubhouse parking lot. Families walked between displays carrying brochures and bottled water. The whole thing felt less like a proposal and more like a celebration. Patricia was building momentum. Every day, more people accepted her version of reality. I parked near the marina and watched for a while. Contractors unloaded supplies. Survey crews marked future walking trails. A realtor guided visitors through a display board showing luxury homes overlooking the water. Several of those homes sat directly inside the area Patricia claimed belonged to the HOA. Yet the documents in my truck were telling a completely different story. The contrast was impossible to ignore. That evening I spread everything across the dining room table. The certified copies, the historical surveys, the county filings, the notes from my grandfather's safe. Piece by piece, the picture became clearer. The original parcel had never disappeared. It had simply been buried beneath decades of assumptions. That was when I decided to call someone I trusted. Daniel Mercer answered on the second ring. Daniel was one of the most respected surveyors in the county. Years earlier, he had helped verify shoreline boundaries after a major storm altered part of the lakefront. He listened quietly while I explained what I found. Papers rustled on his end of the line. Then he asked a simple question. Do you have the original survey references? I looked down at the stack. Every one of them. Silence followed for a moment. Then Daniel exhaled slowly. Bring everything to my office tomorrow morning. I slept very little that night. The wind rattled branches against the house. Waves rolled against the shoreline below the bluff. Somewhere after midnight, I walked onto the porch and looked across the dark lake. Lights from Clearwater Shores reflected on the water. Patricia believed she was expanding her community. The records suggested something much larger was hiding underneath it. And Daniel was about to put those records to the test. Daniel's office overlooked the southern end of the lake. Morning sunlight reflected off the water outside his windows. Inside, every available surface was covered with maps. Historical surveys lay beside modern aerial photographs. County records sat stacked in neat rows. The smell of coffee and printer paper filled the room. Daniel spent nearly 6 hours reviewing every document I brought him. He barely spoke during most of it. That detail alone told me how serious this had become. Around midday, he placed 3 maps side by side across the conference table. One was the original survey from my grandfather's records. One came from the county archives. The third was the revised version Patricia's people had been using. Daniel adjusted his glasses and traced several lines with a pencil. There, he said quietly. I leaned closer. The differences were impossible to miss now. Entire boundary segments had shifted. Historic reference points had disappeared. Several measurements no longer matched the original survey network. Daniel did not sound angry. He sounded precise. That was worse. Precise people tend to be right. He spent another hour running coordinates through survey software. Numbers filled the screen. Colored lines appeared over satellite imagery. Every new layer pointed toward the same conclusion. The original parcel boundaries remained intact beneath decades of development. They had never been properly replaced. They had simply been ignored. Outside, a boat crossed the lake, leaving a white wake behind it. Inside, the room grew very quiet. Daniel finally leaned back in his chair. "You need certified survey verification." I nodded. "Can you do it?" He looked at the maps again. "I already started." That evening, we visited several original survey markers around the lake. Some sat hidden beneath brush. Others were buried near old fence lines. One rested beside a weathered stone marker my grandfather used to mention when I was a kid. The air smelled like damp earth and pine needles. Crickets chirped in the distance. Every marker Daniel located matched the historical records. Every one. The next few days moved quickly. Survey crews appeared throughout the area. Equipment stood beside roads, utility corridors, and shoreline access points. Residents started asking questions. Contractors started asking questions. Even some HOA members began asking questions. Patricia responded by pushing harder. New advertisements appeared online. Another promotional event was scheduled. The message remained the same. Expansion was coming. Ownership was settled. The future was certain. But certainty depends on facts. And facts were beginning to move in a different direction. By Friday afternoon, Daniel called me back to his office. A thick binder sat on the table waiting for me. Certified findings. Survey confirmations. Historical references. County cross-checks. Page after page of evidence. He opened the binder to a large map near the center. Bold red outlines stretched around nearly the entire modern development. Roads. Clubhouse. Marina. Residential sections. Recreational zones. Everything sat inside the same original parcel framework. I stared at it for several seconds. The room felt smaller than before. Daniel closed the binder and slid it toward me. "The community meeting is next week," he said. Through the window, I could see Clearwater shores shining in the afternoon sun. For the first time since the fence appeared, I was looking at the whole picture. The community meeting filled the Clearwater Shores clubhouse beyond capacity. Every chair was occupied. Residents stood along the walls holding printed agendas and coffee cups. Rain clouds drifted across the lake outside the tall windows. Patricia Monroe stood at the front of the room beside a projector screen displaying glossy development renderings. New homes, expanded marina access, walking trails, future growth. The audience watched quietly as she described the next phase of the project. Her confidence never wavered. Not once. That detail mattered, because she still believed the story she had been telling. When the presentation ended, she opened the floor for questions. A few residents asked about construction timelines. Others asked about property values. Then Daniel Mercer stood up from the third row. The room immediately grew quieter. He carried the certified survey binder beneath one arm. I followed him to the front. The projector hummed softly behind us. Rain tapped against the windows. Daniel placed the binder on the table and opened it to the central survey map. Several residents leaned forward. Patricia folded her arms. Daniel spoke calmly. Every sentence was precise. Every statement matched certified records, historical surveys, and county filings. He explained how the original parcel boundaries had been established decades before the community existed. He explained how those boundaries appeared repeatedly throughout the historical record. Then he displayed the certified survey overlay. The room went silent. Colored lines stretched across the map. Roads, marina, clubhouse, residential sections, recreation areas. Every major feature of Clearwater Shores appeared inside the original parcel framework. I watched faces change around the room. Curiosity turned into confusion. Confusion turned into concern. Patricia stepped closer to the table and studied the map. For the first time since this began, she had no immediate response. Daniel continued. He showed the original filings, the county archive records, the survey references, the supplemental documents preserved in my grandfather's safe. Piece by piece, the entire chain connected. Nothing relied on opinion. Nothing relied on assumptions. The evidence spoke for itself. A resident near the back stood up and asked a simple question. "Are you saying the original parcel was never replaced?" Daniel nodded. The room erupted into whispers. Another resident asked whether the revised maps used by the HOA matched the historical record. Daniel answered carefully. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Patricia looked down at the documents spread across the table. The polished renderings behind her suddenly seemed very small. Over the following months, independent reviews confirmed the findings. The revised boundary claims were withdrawn. The fence disappeared from the shoreline. The promotional materials were revised. Contractors removed several project markers. Life slowly returned to normal around the lake. Supply trucks returned. Guests returned. The marina reopened without restrictions. One evening I stood near the western shoreline as the sun settled behind the hills. The water reflected gold and orange across the surface. Wind moved gently through the grass. The community still stood across the lake exactly where it had before. The difference was that the truth finally stood with it. My grandfather had spent a lifetime preserving records most people would have ignored. In the end, those forgotten documents protected everything. Patricia spent years claiming my ranch. She never checked whose land she was